Hello everyone, it's this again, another YouTube video. Ooh, I made more than one. And this time I would like to talk to you about GDQ submissions. And other marathons, I guess, but mostly GDQ submissions. So you've sat down and you've watched some games done quick, possibly even the newest edition, GDQ 2020, that I have strategically timed this video to coincide with the end of. You thought speedrunning seemed pretty good, so you went out and learned a speedrun. You might be thinking about doing that right now. You might even be good at it at this point. In that case, well done! And then submission week rolls around. That time, that most great time, where we all offer our best performances to the somewhat inscrutable and shrouded whims of the Games Committee, who will then decide your worth. Okay, it's not quite as exciting as that, but still, what is actually going on here? And more importantly, how can you tip the odds in your favor? How does the process work? Sadly, it's not as fun as imagining a group of people clad in dark robes sitting around a table discussing every run individually, and the mechanics of the submission process can be a bit difficult to interpret if you're new to it or just don't have the right perspective. So whether you're an interested prospective runner or just an enthusiastic viewer who wants to learn more, I hope I can help you out here. Now, my information for this is sourced from a few places. One is just my personal experience. I've performed 4 runs in Games Done Quick events and a healthy amount in other events that I'm too lazy to count at the moment. Information gleaned from discussions with other runners who've done it, staff involved in the process who I can't quote because they get mad at me, and a very interesting panel held by GDQ themselves about the submission process, which, if you have the time, I highly recommend you listen to it, because it comes from the perspective of the Games Committee themselves, which means it doesn't go into some of the topics I'm about to, but it was invaluable nevertheless in producing this video, so thank you very much GDQ for offering your insight. Most marathons function fairly similarly to each other, so this video will be broadly applicable to all of them, just not all of the specific information will be. GDQ is the biggest and therefore the most well documented, and it's also the one most people care about. And it bears repeating, I am not a member of the Games Committee, and I never have been. I don't have a precise understanding of any one marathon's process. This is intended to be from the perspective of a runner, backed up with GDQ's own statements and some educated pattern analysis, along with some basic rhetoric. So, let me harsh your buzz going in by recognizing the odds. For GDQ 2019, there were 2,759 hours of games submitted, only 258 of which were accepted. So only about 9%, and the accepted number is inflated due to the particular way it counts accepted games with races counting multiple times. Anyway, simply put, in a vacuum, your odds aren't great. Fortunately for you, game submissions don't exist in a vacuum, but still, it's essential that you bear that figure in mind. There are tons of submissions, and a lot of them are definitely good enough for the event, but they can't all get in. That's just the math of it. You can do everything right and still not get accepted. Come to terms with that truth from the word go, and don't take it personally when you are rejected. Pissing and moaning about the games list on Twitter, while definitely fun, is not productive. Your submission might be completely fine, but just submitted at the wrong time. It happens. Rejection isn't an automatic kiss of death. You can try again. So with that in mind, let's get to what you actually can do. So let's assess our runs properly. GDQ specifically gives you 5 games worth of slots to submit with. This will be plenty for most people, since not a lot of people can actually successfully juggle 5 runs to a marathon-ready standard regularly. If you're one of those people, do get in touch and tell me how you do that. But no matter how many you have, it's important you take some time to think about how likely you think it is to actually get in. And there's a few things to consider with that, starting with popularity. Popularity is kind of the big one, and it should be considered the major factor and the rest all minor factors, because this will impact every other aspect of your submission. This is a simple truth of marathon submissions, and of influencer culture in general. With very rare exceptions, like Tetris, marathons like GDQ do not create the hype for a speedrun. They want to capitalize on the hype that already exists in their audience. This is why some games are incredibly reliable list makers, while others languish in obscurity for years on end. Take a long, hard look at what you're submitting and consider whether it's really that well known to the general public, and be honest with yourself. That 4-hour PC 98 adventure game that was only released in Japan that only 4 people have heard about stateside is probably dead in the water, and you need to admit that to yourself. Being precious about it isn't going to get you anywhere. A slight wrinkle to this is that GDQ is a marathon held in the United States, which means that you will need to calibrate your idea of popularity to a primarily American audience. Dragon Quest speedruns are endlessly popular in Japan, but unless you're submitting to RTA in Japan, that's not relevant here. Your odds would be quite slim. It's essential that you maintain an ironclad grip on where your game stands here, however harsh it may be. You're not doing yourself any favors by pretending otherwise. And it's super tempting to bitch about this being unfair and that in a perfect universe we'd all be judging a speedrun's individual merits, and I wouldn't disagree with you, but I didn't come here to critique the process and you didn't come here to listen to that. This is the game you're playing, make your peace with that. But you need not be completely defeatist if your game isn't in a well-known franchise or venerated staple of the speedrunning scene. You have options. GDQ in particular has its awful and silly games blocks, which for most purposes are effectively interchangeable. This can act as a sort of wildcard block for obscure games that would otherwise not find a space. If you can aim for it, it can be worth taking a chance on submitting a game that's otherwise unlikely to get in. It's also possible for you to market your speedrun to other runners, and this can go a very long way to a successful bid for marathon slots. Posting your runs to r/speedrun for some visibility, running the game at smaller marathons, online or otherwise, building a community of runners who can then do the same, streaming your game consistently and building your own audience, creating interesting YouTube content for your game, all of those things can help to get the game out there, become more known, and it absolutely can make the difference, however unlikely you might think. Consider the case of Shift, a runner of SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom. A case of someone evangelizing for a single, otherwise unknown run to the extent that it eventually became a fully fledged community of its own, and made it into GDQ on its own terms. I would argue plenty of Winds of Fortune were blowing in his favor, popular license and, nostalgia for one, but it illustrates that nevertheless, you can do that sort of thing. You can make something from nothing. It's difficult and unfair, but it's possible. Meanwhile, if you are actually running a popular game in a popular franchise like a Mario, a Zelda, or a Mega Man, groovy. You don't have to give a single shit about anything I just said, and can freely ignore all of it in favour of focusing more keenly on the remaining elements. So let's talk about length, because that's quite simple. Longer runs have a harder time getting accepted as they increasingly struggle to justify occupying more of the schedule that could instead have other games. Pretty simple concept, right? The range for this, where this is rarely a problem, seems to lie in the sort of 20-minute to 1 hour region. At that range, you're unlikely to have to care about this. Above that, and you start prompting difficult questions from the committee about whether or not they can really justify the 2 hours for your game. Most runs will struggle to capture audiences for their entire duration if they start going over an hour-ish, even if they're quite good. Really consider honestly whether your run stays truly interesting for its entire duration if it's a longer one. This ties back once again into popularity. It's easier to justify longer runs if they're well-known and popular entities, which is why franchises like Zelda and Pokemon can regularly get runs of 4 hours and above, but other games are kinda hard-pressed to push the 2-hour mark. And again, it's tempting to decry this as unfair. That's a waste of your time. You're not competing with Pokemon, unless you are actually running a Pokemon game, at which point, okay, sure, whatever. But Pokemon can get 4 hours because it's Pokemon, not because of any individually considered merit that it might have as a speed game. You should cast aside that thought you have that because those games can get lengthy runs that you have equivalent odds with a less popular game. You definitely don't. As an aside, Pokemon's just the example I landed on for that. I don't have beef with Pokemon runs, please don't yell at me. Thanks. Conversely, a run can actually be too short. If your run is below or around the 5-minute mark, you're in the territory where the setup takes longer than the actual run. So that makes it also a pretty unlikely bet for obvious reasons. Short games sometimes get sandwiched in between games on similar hardware, deliberately to keep the setup time brisk relative to runtime, but you can only do this so many times in a schedule, so I wouldn't count on that. This is also a bracket where category flexibility can give you the edge. You're allowed to submit more than one category for a given game, and I highly recommend you do this because it gives you more shots on goal, and is especially helpful if the categories vary in length somewhat. You never know exactly what time gap the committee is trying to fill in their schedule, so give them options. If they're looking to include your game already but can't quite find the space, you give yourself another chance if you submit another category. But anyway, that's length. Let's move on to blocks, otherwise known as why Caveman is always placed at 3 AM. So marathon scheduling is difficult. How do you sort this pile of barely related runs into something that resembles a coherent schedule? The solution most have landed on is to sort games by a sort of overarching theme into blocks. These can be as specific as a single franchise and as broad as silly games, but recognize what blocks exist and what block you're aiming for when submitting. Look at previous schedules to get a sense for what blocks exist and where you think you might end up. How long is that block? When is it? What games are in this block? Knowing all of that will help you make the right call. This harkens back to when I mentioned that you're not competing with Pokemon. This is why. Pokemon is its own block. As are many franchises, they compete with themselves in a span of time that is relatively inflexible. So it's pointless to compare as though it's equal pickings or to complain as though it's stealing precious time away from stuff you like. Find your block and assess how strong of a fit you are for it. The runs don't have to be sequential to count as a block for this purpose, you're just looking for similar runs. And GDQ themselves have mentioned at the panel that I mentioned at the very start of this piece that members of the game committee are specialists in their individual genres of runs, lending credence to the school of thought that you need not concern yourself with literally every run submitted to the event, only those of a similar element. Maybe you're into 2D platformers, how well do you think you can compete in that space? Maybe you're more into survival horror games, at which point welcome to the graveyard shift, buddy. You get the idea. The most helpful thing you can do with this is to connect with other runners of games of a similar nature. Knowing what other people are submitting, what games are potentially hot because of new tech discoveries, and what games are not because they were ran at the last event and nothing significant has changed, that information can help you determine whether your game missed out because it's a poor fit or because it was simply the wrong time due to another game having the spotlight, and you should try again. Blocks may technically be a zero-sum game, but there's no need to be, suspicious and solitary with others when dealing with submissions. You'll find more success if you're abreast of what's happening. Even single-franchise blocks can benefit from this thinking. If staying connected allows you to notice a game in a reasonably popular franchise that's had plenty of new strategies found that haven't been widely adopted by the runner base yet, and could potentially get you to a better time in that game, then you have a pretty good opening to pick that game up, adopt those techniques, and become a strong submitter for that game, potentially giving you a good chance within that block when submitting. And people will generally think it's cool that you elevated the game with fresh strategies. Look for these opportunities where you can. They're more common than you might think. I did it with Silent Hill 2 once. And a rare but somewhat worthwhile thing to play for is to be the game that overlaps two blocks. Marathons are often scheduled in such a way as to have a single game that cleanly siegs one block into the next, usually with a game that contains elements of both blocks. As a couple of illustrative examples from my own history, Silent Hill 3 UFO Ending was the overlap game between the horror and the silly games blocks, a position I deliberately went for and succeeded. And Freedom Planet has often served as the overlap between indie platformers, that's not a formal block, but it's definitely a thing, and the Sonic blocks. If you can find a game that you think would make for this kind of suitable overlap, it's worth giving some thought to trying for it. Overlaps can be hard to come by, and they're assets to the schedule's theming, so that gives you a slight edge. So now, let's talk about novelty. Despite people's complaints that the same games get in every time, it's actually extremely rare that the exact same game gets in with the exact same run 2 events in a row. The same kinds of games get in, true, but rarely literally exactly the same game and run combination. This is what's keeping the marathon from being just an entire week of 120-star runs back-to-back. People like new things, but in moderation. Too weird and out there and you're pushing people's comfort zones. Not new enough and you're stagnating and boring. With that in mind, know whether a certain game is fresh or not. If it's just been ran at the previous event and nothing significant has changed, you're probably wasting your submission on it. However, you can consider a different category or perhaps an esoteric mode of play to spice it back up again. Maybe you can play one-handed or on a dance pad or something. Sky's the limit there, get creative with it. Some games having had great success with randomizer and other such ROM hacks, although do bear in mind this once again bottlenecks around popularity. Audiences are harder pressed to accept a quirky run of a game if it's not something you can reasonably expect they already have a solid grasp of. This concept of freshness applies to your own runs as well. If your last PB in a game was several years ago, you can't expect to have a very good shot of getting in. This is one of the reasons submitting a previous marathon VOD as your submission video is actually a pretty bad idea, because it shows nothing has changed about the game since the last time you ran it. At the very least, you need to show that you've ran the game and PB'd in it somewhat recently if you want the best chances. It doesn't have to be a constant stream of PBs, but at least some development within the past few months should suffice. On a more mundane note, new strategies can bring a game back to a state of being fresh. If it was ran in the past but has changed significantly due to lots of new techniques or maybe one big flashy technique, that can be leveraged to bring a game back into the spotlight. As mentioned in the previous section, this is especially powerful if you can find a reasonably popular game that's been a bit slept on for a while with new techniques. If you become aware of a cool new trick in a speed game that blows it wide open like never before, but the game isn't super well known, that provides you with another chance to get it out there more, post about it on social media, Reddit, the like, make a video explaining it if you can. Generating that buzz can propel the run into having enough novelty to make it in. As a bonus, it's good content, and people will usually be willing to take a look at it. When submitting games in a popular franchise that are pretty reliable at getting in, bear in mind where you stand in the cycle, so to speak. Yes, we have to deal with cycles even outside the context of runs. Brilliant, isn't it? Another game in that same franchise might not have been ran for a while and so is more due for an appearance than one that just had an appearance. A rejection simply for poor timing on the cycle is common and nothing to get that worked up about. Try again later and have confidence that your turn will come back around. Now, let's talk about being the power submitter. This part's fun. What happens if two people submit the same game with the same category? Well, it's quite simple, actually. You just take whoever has the best PB. This is one reason why keeping your leaderboard PB up to date around the time of submission is very important, because the committee doesn't have comprehensive knowledge of every individual community and will not know that your real PB is actually minutes better, but it's not on the leaderboard because you didn't submit it. Barring circumstances where a runner provides an unsuitable submission, if multiple people are going to submit the same game, the person with the best time is the power submitter, and will be the preferred choice if that game is selected. Ideally, this should be you. Note that power submitter does not mean world record holder, although a world record holder is a power submitter by default. You just need the best time out of the people who are going to submit to the event, which can afford you some wiggle room if stronger players don't submit for one reason or the other. Know who the power submitters are for your game, what events they submit to, and what categories. Again, the best way to do this is just to connect with your community and talk to people. You don't need to be sneaky about it, that probably won't really help you anyway. Just keep the information in mind. Most people aren't going to hide their submissions or plans from you, and there's not that much you can do to meaningfully play games with this in the time frame provided anyway. The consequence of this is that if you're submitting for a game that has multiple submissions and you're not the power submitter, you're functionally wasting your submission. That 20th place run you have of a game where there's 5 other submissions for the same game from higher ranked players, there's no point. Your odds just aren't low, they're basically 0 while someone else holds power submitter. And that can seem harsh and dismissive, but it is sadly a truth of the process. That 120th place run of Mario Odyssey you were thinking of submitting? Training mode is the place for you, pal, not primetime GDQ. By a similar token, even if you are technically power submitter by dint of being the only submitter, but there's an extremely large delta between you and the world record, your odds are still being damaged by that. You don't need to have world record, but you do at least need to make an effort to be within striking distance. It's very unlikely a marathon will want to field your ass if you're 30 minutes off the record and the run's only 2 hours long. They will check the leaderboard when making the decision. They'll notice. Hope isn't completely lost if you're not the power submitter for your desired game. If there's a small enough difference in personal bests, a race is a potential idea. You'd need to actually communicate with the other runner and get them to agree to it, which depends on who you're asking, how well you get on with them, and how much they like races. Some runners are pretty up for a race submission because they just find it more fun. Others, not so much. Coordinate this with your prospective race partners in advance of actually creating your submission. Don't just slap "would be willing to race" in your submission text without asking anyone first. That isn't how it works, and it's slightly annoying. Other such group ideas include relays and 2 players, 1 controller, but there's no limit here if you have a really cool idea. But remember, especially if it's you, that the power submitter has the leverage when deciding whether or not to agree to such ideas. If they don't want to do it, but otherwise plan to submit on their own, your idea is probably screwed. I can't think of any instances of a single power submission being beaten out by other runners organizing a race or a relay, but plenty of instances of the reverse happening. A race can also be a stress-relieving proposal if you and another runner are in close contention for a game's record at the time, and thus power submitter status is constantly in flux. Unless you want the stress of having to remain constantly on the grind to beat the other guy to get the marathon slot in the game you're pretty sure is gonna get in, a race can be a way of mutually agreeing to lock it in without stressing each other out, which is an agreeable compromise many are willing to take. Again, communicate this with each other very clearly. If you're in that scenario, something this process absolutely allows you to do is get a better time than the other submitter, intentionally conceal it until the submission period is already close to over, then submit it to the board, giving you power submitter status and leaving the other person no time to react. I'm not actually advocating for this approach because it's a tremendous dick move and will instantaneously piss off a bunch of people in your community, but I am going to point out this is something you can totally do under the current system. Draw your own conclusions. Failing all of that, you can go gimmick and try a different category or gimmick run. This has low odds of success, but it's a non-zero play that's worked out for lots of people, me included. If you can't submit any percent and can't hope to outmuscle the power submitter in time, your only option is to play to your outs and bust out that all-major nose pickings run or whatever your local equivalent category is. Power submitter is only local to the particular category, so if you have other categories at your disposal, now is the time to deploy them. Even if there seems to be a clear favourite category in the community, it's worth at least giving yourself the chance to succeed. Naturally, if you're the only submitter, none of that really matters, especially so if you're the only runner. Having world record isn't inherently interesting to the committee if you're the only runner, sorry to say. So that's all a lot to think about, and this is before you've even written the submission. What's the best way to do that? So different marathons have different style guides for submissions. Read these thoroughly and don't botch it. Much like a job application, one of the easiest ways for the committee to start thinning down the literally thousands of hours of games they have to get through is to immediately bin anything that has an obvious lack of care put into it. Addressed earlier, but worth repeating, if your submission involves multiple people, communicate that and make sure everyone agrees to it and specify who you're grouping within your submission and make sure others do the same. Don't just slap it on there and work it out later. That's awkward and confusing for everyone involved. Choose an estimate you can consistently be close to. Don't submit an estimate that's lower than your PB, and don't submit your estimate using in-game time. Reality doesn't work off the in-game timer. The estimate's for the schedule. Remember that being a minute over an estimate is better than being 20 minutes under. An estimate is precisely that, an estimate, not an upper limit before you get vaudeville hooked off the stage. Furthermore, don't attempt to circumvent power submitter by prices writing and submitting an estimate that's slightly lower than someone else for your game. Not only does this not work because the leaderboard will tell the story, you look like a complete jackass. Conversely, if you are the power submitter, doing this is unnecessary to begin with, and you will still look like a jackass, but it can't really hurt you, at least. As for what to write in the body of your submission, it's nearly impossible to know what you actually should put there to successfully sell the committee on your game, but as a general rule, try not to sound like you're dryly reciting the Wikipedia article for it like you're writing a boring book report. The game is a thing released in 2004 for the Sega Don't do that sounds boring. Try to avoid trite and tautological language like describing your run as fast-paced. They're speedruns. They're all fast-paced here. Such phrases don't offer any further information about your game and are a waste of characters. Feel free to inject some humor in here if you can manage it. It's not an actual job interview, so showing a bit of your personality is good. Just make sure you're actually funny before you hit submit. People get that wrong a lot. Consider previous things I've said when writing your submission. Popularity and novelty will determine how much explanation of your game is necessary. A sufficiently popular game can get away with basically nothing written at all. People have done this. But the more unusual your run type is, the more you may have to explain yourself in the description. If your game's already been in before, focusing on novelty is your bread and butter. What's new about it? What's changed? That's what they're looking for if they've taken the game before. They already know what it is, and you can skip the introductions. Play up new techniques and strategies that have been developed since last time, or how unique your particular category is that hasn't been shown yet. Counterintuitively, it's my belief that the video is actually the least important part of your submission, and a lot of this is due to the logistics involved. Remember that figure I mentioned at the very start? 2,759 hours of submitted runs is about 115 consecutive entire days of nothing but speedruns. They ain't watching all of that. There's literally no way they could possibly watch all of that. That being said, make sure your video follows the rules laid out, that it is actually you performing the entire run yourself. Your video also shouldn't be years old, and we've addressed earlier, but submitting a past marathon VOD or a years old PB is a bad idea. It shows nothing has changed and there's nothing new to see here. Use a recent video. At GDQ's own panel on the subject, they stated that swearing wasn't grounds for being rejected in your VOD, so don't worry about that. GDQ is not as touchy as you may have been led to believe, so unless you're spouting slurs left and right or screaming in incoherent rage at the game, you're probably fine. This will probably hurt some feelings, but crafting a bespoke submission video where you record an entire run with marathon-style commentary to represent the game in the most marathon-esque condition seems like a good idea on paper, but is probably a waste of your time. At the very least, it satisfies the recency part, but as we've established, they're probably not actually going to watch it for more than a minute or two to confirm the details. There are numerous accounts of people creating bespoke, unlisted submission videos that received 0 views or a scant minute or two of watch time. Exceptions to this are when your run type is unusual, say a blindfolded run or some other sort of esoteric run gimmick. Bespoke videos are appropriate for these, as you need to demonstrate that you can actually do the run you're proposing. Or if your run is more of a showcase than a speedrun, this is another time a bespoke video is not only useful, but basically necessary. If it can't be satisfactorily explained in the text body of the submission, this is where a bespoke video comes in handy. Otherwise, just use a normal clean PB video and save yourself the hassle. So, you did all of that, you thought about all of the above, and you still got declined. What do you do now? Well, as I mentioned at the very start of this video, sometimes you can do basically everything right and still get declined just due to the sheer submission volume, meaning lots of entirely worthy submissions have to miss out. Hopefully this is you, but I'll be the first to admit that a lack of feedback on this front can make it difficult to discern if you simply need to stay persistent or are actively throwing your time into a game that's got next to no chance of making it in. That's a judgment call for you to make. Basically nobody gets a game in every event, and some games are inherently going to have a very hard time with this. Longer JRPGs that aren't Pokemon or Kingdom Hearts in particular are competing for a relatively small number of game slots. If that's you, you're either in for the long game or you need to consider broadening your palette. Astute observers may have noticed that the system as it is constructed rewards variety a fair bit, what with having 5 game slots and several category slots for each game. This is true, and something I recommend you work towards. Knowing more runs and categories gives you better odds, as well as it just being good to have some variety and perspective in your speedrunning and creative endeavors. It's difficult to realistically assess how good a run is if you're only ever fixated on one run and can't take some time to explore other things. However, this imposes a dilemma. It's difficult to stay in the position of power submitter for lots of games at the same time, especially if those games are popular ones. Again, this is a subjective judgment and will be for you to decide. Sometimes if you want to get games into marathons, letting that popular game slide to focus on a variety of games that will bear more fruit can absolutely be the right call. Don't throw your time into a black hole if you don't think you have a reasonable shot of coming out on top of it. And at the end of the day, it's just fucking video games, man. I know I just said a whole bunch of words about it, but think about what it is that you actually want out of a GDQ appearance. It's a worthy thing to pursue and can absolutely be a fantastic opportunity for you to show a game you'll love or grow your stream, but a single GDQ appearance does not an overnight megastar make. It's not going to instantly make you drown in riches or pay your electricity bill, whatever hack YouTube speed pundits might suggest. There's also a healthy dose of luck at play. No matter how good your submission is, a new hot game can completely steal the show and ruin your chances out of nowhere, or the committee could just make a surprising decision to try something new. It's at least somewhat arbitrary. It's ultimately consistency that will be rewarded in the long term, and nowhere is that more clear than the people who can consistently be marathon suitable. So don't collapse into existential dread if you get rejected once, twice, or even more. It's okay to be disappointed, but compose yourself. Wash the shame off your face, and try again. Good luck, everyone. Hey, thanks for listening to that video there. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was insightful and interesting to you. I hope that some of my takes don't upset people. But yeah, if you enjoyed it, do the whole like, comment, subscribe thing, and I can keep making more of these. The response I got to the first video was pretty good, so here's another one, hopefully on a topic that's a bit less inflammatory than my last one. You know, it's a bit ironic I chose to make this video around the time of GDQ 2020, a marathon I didn't get a game into. But anyway, thank you very much for listening. Goodbye now.